The myth of Persephone speaks directly to the distortion in this view by reminding us that narcissism leads to death, that the fertility of the earth is in some mysterious way tied to the continuation of the mother-daughter relationship, and that the life cycle itself arises from an alternation between the world of women and that of men. That's what a female hero might look like vis-a-vis the male ones we've spent a lot of time with in our last lectures. Our own age has produced a lot of female heroes, especially in literature and especially that in the novel. To illustrate this, I'd like to spend our last few minutes of this lecture on a 19th century female hero from a classic American novel, Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. Now, the Scarlet Letter, I know you're going to say the Scarlet Letter really isn't a myth in the way that the other myths that we've done in this course have been, but it's at least mythical in the sense of being not literally true, but it contains a wisdom and a meaning that we can recognize anyway. And on the other hand, it's at least partly mythical in that that story, the story of the Scarlet Letter, has become part of our consciousness. Most people will recognize a reference to the Scarlet Letter even if they've never read the book, just as many people who've never read anything about King Arthur will know what a reference to Camelot is, or people who have never read the Bible will know about Eve, the serpent, and the forbidden fruit. The Scarlet Letter has become mythical, at least in that kind of sense. And this also gives us a chance that we haven't had too much chance to do in this course, aside from a little bit that we did back in Lecture 2, and that's to show some of the ways in which myths underpin and provide structure and meaning to modern works, which are based on those myths, whether self-consciously on the part of the author or not. Hawthorne called his book not a novel but a romance, which suggests that it doesn't have quite the fidelity to everyday reality that realists were beginning to use as a definition of the novel at his time, which is 1850. Which, of course, it being a romance rather than a novel doesn't diminish its truth value for us, especially for those of us who have spent the last few weeks working with myths. What I would like to suggest here is that in some important ways in this romance, Hester Prynne and Pearl are direct descendants of Demeter and Persephone, and they give us another picture of what a female hero looks like, this time in almost modern dress. You probably all know the story, but since you haven't read it since high school, perhaps, maybe a brief summary of how it starts wouldn't be a bad idea. Hester Prynne comes to Boston in the 17th century, and Boston, of course, as we know from our history, was a rigidly Puritan town in that period. When her husband doesn't show up, he was on a separate ship, and it's understood that he was lost at sea somewhere. And then she bears an illegitimate child. She's first imprisoned, and then she's released, but ostracized from her community. She's made to wear a scarlet A, which she has to wear on her dress wherever she goes. She designs and embroiders the letter herself, but she makes it so elaborate and so arabesque that most people consider it a mark of pride rather than a mark of repentance and humility. Well, the plot thickens. We know, although nobody else in town does except Hester herself, that her husband, an elderly doctor named Roger Chillingworth, has arrived. He has sworn Hester to secrecy so she doesn't give away his identity. She has refused under all manner of pressure to divulge the name of Pearl's father. Chillingworth takes up a kind of perverse and obsessive quest to find out who that father is. He eventually fastens on a young, brilliant, beautiful minister of the town's church, a young man named Arthur Dimmesdale. And he eventually winds up even moving into Dimmesdale's house to tend him, since the minister seems to be slowly wasting away into what seems a kind of fatal illness. We learn along the way that Dimmesdale is Pearl's father, and the sickness that he is suffering from is partly the result of the guilt he feels at being the shepherd of a Puritan congregation on the one hand, while holding on the other hand the awareness of his own sinfulness. There's a lot of interaction among these characters, and I recommend that you reread it. It's still a great read after all these years. Toward the end of the book, Hester and Arthur plan to escape with Pearl back to Europe somewhere where they can live as a family and start life all over again, far, far from Puritan Boston. But Chillingworth somehow learns of their plan, and he books passage on the same ship. So on the day before the ship is supposed to leave, Dimmesdale mounts the town scaffold, and he confesses his guilt, and then baring his breast shows that he has branded on his chest a scarlet letter A. He dies on that scaffold. Pearl sends him off with a kiss. Chillingsworth dies within a year, and then Hester and Pearl leave town. They leave Boston. Years later, Hester comes back herself without Pearl. Pearl has now married and has moved away to Europe. No one by this time would anymore insist that Hester still wear her scarlet A, but she does anyway. She becomes known in Boston for her charitable work. She dies years later, and she's buried next to Dimmesdale with a single scarlet letter A on the tomb that they share. Here in this story, the hero was sent on her quest not by personal choice, but by circumstance, like the princess who drops her golden bowl down the well, or Gilgamesh, who's sent off on his quest by the death of Enkidu, or like Muindo, driven out of town by his father. Here, it's the pregnancy and birth of Pearl that sends Hester out of the comfortable confines of her community into a solitary and fearful world. She's forced into heroic consciousness by the fact of her motherhood, as the narrator tells us about her at this point in the story, standing alone in the world, alone as to any dependence on society, and with little Pearl to be guided and protected, alone and hopeless of retrieving her position, even had she not scorned to consider it desirable, she cast away the fragments of a broken chain. The world's law was no law for her mind. The narrator tells us that, in fact, for a while, revolutionary thoughts visited Hester, thoughts that would not have dared to enter any other dwelling in New England. The symbol for Hester as the novel goes along is a wild rose bush which grows outside the prison door. Once on her quest, her heroic virtues are unmistakably female. Standing for hours on that scaffold while the community waits for her to identify Pearl's father, she retreats into herself to find strengths and values that will allow her to stand against her entire community. What she learns there standing on the scaffold is that she has a choice of whether to give in or not, despite the enormous pressures that are arrayed against her. And she wins, reaffirming in the process the act that had generated Pearl in the first place in opposition to all that the patriarchal culture can throw against her. Powers says this about her. She says, alone, apart, she accepts herself as a living critic of the society which sought to subjugate her. Alone, apart, and you imagine 17th century Puritan Boston, how alone and how apart she really is. In fact, Hester becomes a kind of another Demeter. Like Demeter and Persephone, Hester and Pearl are the dyad at the center of this story that makes sense of it. Like Demeter, Hester sometimes gives herself over to grief, but sometimes she also gives herself over to seasons of great pride and joy in her daughter. Also, like Demeter, she accepts her position outside of society without standing in radical opposition to it. Like Demeter with Zeus, she resists patriarchal authority without attacking it. She, in fact, initially survives in her community as a kind of artist, doing such fine needlework that even respectable women have to come to her, since no one does this kind of work better, even though they would never invite her into their homes or even greet her when they meet her on the street. But as Pearl grows up, Hester also becomes a kind of ministering angel, helping the poor, visiting the sick, until some people begin to think that the A stands for able, not for adulteress. Again, like Demeter, she turns personal grief into a boon for the community. She comes very close even to saving Dimmesdale, but when that fails, she metamorphoses once again, disappearing for a time and then reappearing, still wearing that familiar A, but now no longer as a sign of sin, but as a sign of a boon brought back to her community. Like Demeter, she has never really left her community, and the heroism that she expresses is expressed in communal gestures, not in individualistic ones. That's perhaps what a female hero would look like. The arc of her journey could look the same as a male one, but It embodies all of the values that the male hero, trying to find his anima, goes out to seek. The narrator gets the last word about Hester here, and it's such a beautiful ending for the novel that I want to read you just the last paragraph. This is what the narrator, the unnamed narrator, says about Hester. And as Hester Prynne had no selfish ends, nor lived in any measure for her own profit and enjoyment, people brought all their sorrows and perplexities and besought her counsel as one who had herself gone through a mighty trouble. Women more especially, in the continually recurring trials of wounded, wasted, wronged, misplaced, or erring and sinful passion, or with the dreary burden of a heart unyielded because unvalued and unsought, came to Hester's cottage, demanding why they were so wretched and what the remedy. Hester comforted and counseled them as best she might. She assured them, too, of her firm belief that at some brighter period, when the world should have grown ripe for it, in heaven's own time, a new truth would be revealed in order to establish the whole relation between man and woman on a surer ground of mutual happiness. That's what a female hero might look like. Next time, we are going to continue our looks at female heroes by looking into a different place, into fairy tales. It's a place where, according to many scholars and critics, female heroes have found their homes. Fairy tales are one of the places where mythology winds up, in fact, surviving in tales that we use to teach our children about the way things are. Next time, we will take a look at two fairy tales that you're probably already familiar with. One, a classical one, Cupid and Psyche, and one, a more modern one, Beauty and the Beast. That's next time.